In November of 1785, Robert Burns, a Scottish farmer, was plowing his fields. In doing so, he turned over a mouse nest that was built underground. The damage that he caused bothered him, and it influenced him to write about his experience later that day. The result was the composition of a poem that has been with us ever since. Let me read a more modern translation without the Scottish brogue. The best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry, and leaves us nothing but grief and pain for promised joy. Tell me you haven't had in a morning or an entire day that was exactly that. Everything you thought you'd accomplish did not work out that way. It's not even that the plans that you made were necessarily off. It's just that there are variables that fall beyond your ability to control. One of those variables is timing. You can have a decent plan, but initiate it with poor timing. For instance, it is common knowledge that the best time to drive a motor vehicle on concrete is when the surface is hardened. Yet on August 15th, a driverless car in San Francisco parked itself in wet concrete. At the time of the reporting, no one was exactly sure how the car got there. However, the construction area had been marked off with orange cones. And on either end of the city block, there were workers who stood with flags for human drivers to see. The one who took the photo as evidence that the robocar idea is not quite ready had this to say: "It thinks it's a road, and it ain't, because it ain't got a brain, and it can't tell that it's freshly poured concrete." The timing of this incident is even more ironic or humorous. You see, prior to the wet concrete parking job, San Francisco had allowed two different companies limited hours to test run their version of robocars to see how things would work. And during that testing period from June to August, the city has logged approximately 600 traffic incidents involving driverless vehicles since June. Even so, just a few days before this concrete fiasco, the California Public Utilities Commission had voted to grant permits for both companies to have full 24/7 access to all the streets of San Francisco. The best laid schemes of mice and men. A summary of the famous poem could be stated like this: no matter how well you prepare, something's bound to go sideways. Today we come to part of Ecclesiastes that has probably been the most recognized, even by those who have no particular religious background. And I'm sure that phrases from this poem are quoted by individuals who have no idea where it came from. But it comes from chapter 3. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. The Byrds made this famous song famous in 1965, but only after the composer took the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes and turned it into a folk song. And as you read the following verses, some of you may hear that song or melody playing through your head, but I hope that won't distract you from what we're about to study. This opening verse follows directly after the final section of Ecclesiastes 2. At the end of chapter 2, the teacher, Hazlet, has expressed his frustration that all the things he might obtain or accomplish in life will be handed over to another, and there's no way to know if that person will be a fool or a wise man. Death is a factor that prevents us from determining the long-term benefit of all we've accomplished during our lifetimes. Now, the issue of death will hit us again right away in the very next line, but for the next 8 verses, we will look at life from the perspective of time. The human journey is marked by moments and events that play out from the beginning to the end of our lives. So time is one of those factors that we all experience and understand, but if anybody asked you to define it or explain it, it's very often difficult to do so. And as we come to chapter 3, the teacher begins writing as he has before. He states his thesis right up front, and then offers examples of evidence that his opening statement is an accurate one. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. The word itself will appear 28 times, as 14 examples of contrasting events are given to us. We'll look at them more directly, but we need to treat those entire 14 as a larger unit. And we start by checking out the terms that overlap in the very first verse. Now, I personally like the word season because of the translation that I memorized and because of the song that plays through my head. But season implies a period of time, like the 3 months of autumn. It also implies a slow transition from one activity to the next. But that's not what this is describing. There is an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. The words are virtually synonymous. And while it is true that some moments do turn into a season of life, the emphasis is on specific points in time rather than continuity. The New American Standard Version captures it even better. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. The second half clarifies even further that there is a coordination between the timing and the plan that unfolds at a particular moment. It's a description of a larger blueprint where everything fits together. And from verse 1, we follow with a series of contrasts, and some are actually fully opposite of one another. There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to avoid embracing, a time to search and a time to count as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. With the repetition of that single word, it's easy to jump to some conclusions about these times. And yet the teacher has not defined the details of such events. He simply lists them as he has observed or experienced such things in his lifetime. And what is true in our English is also true in the Hebrew. Both languages use this word to describe a couple of categories of time. One is a point in time. The other is less focused on the clock and more on the substance. For example, a time of war. February 24th, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The first one marks a moment on the historical timeline when that war began. The second is defined by events and circumstances that go along with armed conflict, and both are rightly considered and identified a time of war. Another premature conclusion about these various moments is to see them as statements of morality. For example, since there is an appointed time for each thing, then does that mean that I have to figure out the right time and the wrong time? See, the presupposition leads a person who's reading this to think that it's my job to figure out which is which and make sure I do the right thing at the right time or I might get myself in trouble. Now, granted, putting on a comedy routine in front of the casket at a funeral is probably not the best idea, but that decision falls squarely within the realm of exercising wisdom or not. A wise person will want to discern the proper time for such activities. But these 8 verses are not an assessment of what is right and wrong. The text is descriptive, not prescriptive. Descriptive paints a picture of what happens without any moral assessment. So, for example, we can say, the colonies fought against the nation of England in the War for Independence. There's nothing in that sentence that says the colonists were right, or that England was right, or that the causes for the revolution were righteous or wicked. It simply is a statement of one time of war. Prescriptive, on the other hand, is about something you're required to do. You know, when you get a prescription from your doctor, it's not meant to be a suggestion. It's meant to be part of your healing process. And to confuse these two when we're reading God's word is a very common yet very dangerous mistake that a person can make. So to clarify again, what we're reading here is descriptive, illustrating different times of life that are common to humanity. The rightness or the wrongness of any single statement is not given to us. There's an occasion for everything, and a time for every activity under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. This opening phrase is a description of the entirety of a single life. All of what constitutes life under the sun is captured by the 14 contrasts or opposites. And those contrasts reinforce the idea that nothing is left out in between these two defining moments of birth and death. The planting and the uprooting carries the same imagery of life and death, but in the agricultural arena. And any gardener knows that weeding is a very necessary and real part of farming in order to protect the crops that you want to keep. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear and a time to build. War is mentioned by name later. So this is probably more a reference to animal sacrifice for worship or for preparing for a family to eat dinner. The teacher would also be familiar with those Old Testament accounts of sickness and disease sent as a punishment by God. While the second phrase is obvious as part of the renovations or changes that need to happen wherever you might live in an apartment or home, and yet when coupled with war, that last phrase also requires the demolition of certain structures and the rebuilding once the war is over. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. These cover some of the core emotional aspects of life that are often revealed through some particular physical expression and activity like crying or celebrations. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to avoid embracing. Now, a 3-year-old may love this and believe that the Bible is giving him permission to throw stones. But in an agricultural society, this is an important part of farming as well, clearing the stones from the field in order to grow your crops. In fact, scattering stones on your enemy's field was an act of war in the Old Testament to prevent them from planting food. In contrast, the gathering of stones is part of using those kinds of materials for assembling new buildings. And the last phrase about embracing would apply to both marriages and friendships. A time to search and a time to count as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Now, it doesn't seem like there's ever a good time to count something as lost. But the teacher simply lists these as examples, one more of those events that we know under the sun. Of course, the hoarders among us will be very upset by the second half, a time to throw away. But when the time of spring cleaning actually does arrive 6 months from now, it seems quite appropriate to get rid of the stuff in storage that's serving very little purpose anymore. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak. Both of these easily apply to the mourning process in Eastern cultures. The tearing of your clothes was an expression of grief. And when you read Job's account, it is clear that his friends approached Job in his sorrow with both silence and words. And most often they were better staying silent than what they said. Even beyond the context of mourning, the description is one of the variety of activities that are either constructive or destructive. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Remember, these are not commands for us to identify the moment that my hatred of you is justified or when I can declare war on my enemy. The teacher is simply cataloging his observations of the many moments of life where these things actually take place. The list of 14 contrasts are moments and times that describe what we know to be true as we live through life. And in any activity, in any response to situations or people or events, everything happens in its time. We begin with birth, something you have no control over. And then with death, something you may know is coming close, but you still have no control over its timing. We've planting and harvesting, building and demolition, collection and distribution, mending and tearing apart. And with such core activities of life, we have responses that are part of that as well. So we laugh or cry, we dance or mourn, we love or hate. There is an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. Now, that being the case, it kind of removes the idea of coincidences or randomness, doesn't it? A few verses later, we will be reminded again that our perspective is very limited and that there is one who is overseeing all of those times. We're not the ones with the full blueprint in front of us. God is in control of everything that happens on the largest scale, including the coordination of the 4 seasons of the year and the rainstorm that's hitting us now. And yet he also controls the individual timelines of human lives. And so while the patterns and repetition of common events continue throughout history, God also intervenes as he determines. One person is given an unexpected opportunity. Another loses his job without much warning. And because of this description, some have walked away from chapter 3 with what is known as Christian fatalism. The belief that what will be, since all his past, present, and future events have already been predetermined by God, right down to the last moment. But fatalism as a concept is not a valid conclusion from Ecclesiastes or from reading the rest of the Bible. The teacher is making a case that our activities fit into a grand design. You see, the mystery is that in God's sovereignty, his oversight includes our individual choices. We make choices that sadden him or choices that please him. But either way, his greater plan continues moving forward, whether or not we decide to cooperate with him. Now, we don't have to understand the paradox, and please don't try. Yet God has ordered his creation in a fixed way, but humans are free to respond to that order as they choose. Now, with the observations of the times of life in the backdrop, the teacher now returns to the question that has been a thread for the entire book so far. What does the worker gain from his struggles? Like the previous experiments, to find meaning and value in pleasure, in acquiring wisdom, in creative endeavors, in construction projects or designing parks and guest houses. As you look at the various moments that mark our lives, how does a person benefit from any one of those things long term? And the question anticipates another negative answer. There is no benefit. And this is one of the great frustrations that we share together with the teacher who is writing this as he expresses it in this part of the letter. We can do our best to create a plan and the timing of the plan, and yet everything is frustratingly out of the control of human beings. And the teacher returns again to another observation about our existence. I have seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. This statement is very close to what we saw in chapter 1, where the task that keeps us busy is clearly stated as unpleasant, a miserable task, an unhappy business, a heavy burden. And what is the task that we humans have been given? The search for meaning. Where am I from? It's a question of origins. Who am I? It's a quest for identity. Where am I going? It's a quest for purpose. The human search for answers to these core questions is difficult, and the investigation encompasses a lifetime of investigation. We won't be done until we're not here. And yet it is built into us to find out. So as we come to verse 11, we learn more of why that is. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts. But man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. And here we are reintroduced to the planner behind all the various times and seasons. And this verse has some important things to say, so let's look at it for a little while. We'll start with the first part. He has made everything appropriate in his time. It takes us right back to verse 1. There is a proper time for every event, and yet that timing is according to God's perspective and design, not ours. Now, I realize that the Christian song from the late 70s uses the word beautiful in describing God's timing. In his time, he makes everything beautiful in his time. And I like singing the song, but the context of chapter 3 is not emphasizing aesthetic beauty, the way you think of something that's pleasing to look at. It's about the appropriateness of what God does when he does it. And how any particular moment might be considered appropriate is not revealed to us most of the time. We do not see the beauty in a tragic accident, nor in the circumstance of one who was fired from his job only months before reaching retirement. The beauty comes in recognizing and acknowledging the place and purpose of every person, thing, or event in God's overall plan. He has made everything appropriate in its time. Now, I'd like to come back to this idea before we're done, but one of the more recognized phrases in verse 11 is what comes next. He has also put eternity in their hearts. Now, eternity is not the absence of time, as we might imagine it to be. In fact, if you look at the book of Revelation, in describing the new heavens and the new earth, our final state of existence, there are still references to the passage of days and months going by. So a better way to understand eternity is this: the extension of time, as far back as it goes and as far forward as it might reach. God has given us something that no other creature has: an awareness of ourselves in the passage of time. We can anticipate the long future ahead of us, including a wedding someday or having children at some point. We can look forward to graduating school, owning a home, or taking on a new hobby. And we can remember when enjoying that big dinner did not create any physical side effects, or when working a full day did not sap your energy so that you were fine to go out late in the evening and do something else right after work. As a result of this awareness of our time and our place, we long for something that lasts and might offer us clarity concerning all those individual moments of our existence. That being the case, let me read a couple of quotes about this issue of eternity implanted in our hearts, since each of them offers a valuable insight. One thing that elevates us above the animal world, in addition to the God-given sense of eternity, is our desire to understand the whole. This quest is a deep-seated desire, a compulsive drive because man is made in the image of God, to appreciate the beauty of creation on an aesthetic level, to know the character, composition, and meaning of the world on an academic and philosophical level, and discern its purpose and destiny on a theological level. Man has an inborn inquisitiveness and capacity to learn how everything in his experience can be integrated to make a whole. It's true. And our frustration comes from knowing that we were created for more than this world can offer, and yet we are unable to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So the rest of verse 11 says as much. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts. But man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. For us living on this side of the resurrection, even we can still not know the particular significance of certain events or seasons of our lives when they appear. Instead, by faith, we trust that God will use our efforts to honor him in those moments. But we have no solid answer for why things happen as they do, especially when certain things seem to be going in the opposite direction of what you might expect God would want. I've done more than enough funerals over the years, and several of them were requested of me by local funeral homes. A funeral home calls looking for a Baptist pastor and asks if I can conduct the service, and most of the times I say yes. Every funeral that I conduct contains the message of hope in Christ alone, since presenting the gospel at such an event is a given for me. And every time I've done my part, the family is very gracious in offering their sincere gratitude, even though we've just met. And yet I wonder if the time I spent there will make any difference. Every person attending will soon disperse to their homes in towns far from here. And as far as I know, that family and I will not cross paths again. So there's no direct way to know if anything said or prayed will have any impact. However, God ordained a time to mourn, and they called me to be part of it. So if I can, I take advantage of that moment to speak God's word. The rest is out of my hands. We can identify a sense of order in the universe and in the seasons of life, and yet we can't control any of them. We are instructed that God has made everything appropriate in its time, even though we don't see it. And so it doesn't seem fair that we're hardwired to satisfy this eternity in our hearts, even though each event and moment comes and goes. It just doesn't last. Where's the eternity? And it doesn't seem right that we can identify order in the universe and long for that order, and yet are unable to bring order to our individual lives. For many, this disconnect between the longing and the reality leads to despair. Man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. And some will just stop right there. Throw your hands up. But living in despair is not God's plan either. Since that is true, then what should be our perspective and response as we live through from one moment to the next? Verse 12. I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God when anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his effort. In light of everything that's been said in the first 11 verses, this is the first of two I know statements in response to what he's observed. And in this case, it's a reinforcement of chapter 2. I know that there's nothing better than to look upon the good and to enjoy it. Good things come from a good God who has given them all for our enjoyment. And then we studied this concept last time. We came across an idea that gets perverted if we're not very careful to make an important distinction here. To enjoy the good life is not a declaration of the hedonistic worldview. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It is an appreciation of the moment for what it actually is when it comes, God-given. So we seize the day. Coelette's carpe diem is an expression of faith, not of self-fulfillment. It's not the greedy consumption of experiences and pleasures before oblivion comes to consume us. It's rather the patient and joyful embrace of daily life as it comes to us one moment at a time as a gift from God. Since we focused on this a few weeks back, we don't need to spend a lot of time there now. But this is the second time this reminder will show up in Ecclesiastes, and it's not the last time we will see it. And such statements are intended to ground us in a world where moments keep passing by. While the spectrum of different times to search, or to be silent, or to throw away, or to gather may appear random, these couple of verses remind us that the variety of those occasions actually become moments in time to enjoy life. It's like riding the crest of the wave. It's destructive unless you're at the right spot, and then it's something else. From our perspective, many things seem to be unrelated or even contradictory. We don't have the whole picture, and so the individual threads become occasions that are impossible to tie it all together. It all looks arbitrary. And as a possible response to the criticism that God is acting arbitrarily, the teacher now explains something else that he knows about God from verse 14. I know that all God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. Compared to us, the actions of God, the work of God, the labor of God is the kind of activity that will last. And his activity includes the coordination of every time and occasion under heaven that we've been studying. So verse 14 is a statement of God's sovereignty. People can complain. They can accuse God of being inconsistent or being mean. They can even try to alter the times to suit their own desires and bring about their own moments of greatness in history. But God's work is eternal. And there's nothing that anyone can do to alter his larger plan. It is permanent, complete, and secure. And so while some may look at life under the sun and be frustrated by their lack of control over it, or by their inability to understand how things are actually integrated, God does everything he does for a purpose. I know that all God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that all people will be in awe of him. We're talking about the fear of God. And fearing God means accepting one's own limitations. On the one hand, the earth and its inhabitants are plagued with futility, unreliability, and the short-lived satisfaction of certain moments that pass through. On the other hand, people can see the creation order itself with repeating patterns and predictability in people and in nature, in the movement of the stars and of the planets, and in the seasons cycling through from one year to the next. And as I consider this portion of Ecclesiastes 3, it forces me to go back to Romans 1. Creation screams of the hand of God behind it. And those observations of the rain falling to grow our crops and the beauty of the sunset, they're all given to draw a person to reach the conclusion as evidence that there is a God. And God has so worked that man should fear him. The Lord has created a world that consists of times where certain things happen according to his will. We lack the ability to discern those times on a consistent basis. And yet, from observing creation, we can know that God exists. And even the most remote people groups on the planet will be held responsible for that recognition. Yet the person who can recognize such things as coming from the hand of a powerful creator is the one who is exercising humility and the beginning of wisdom. A wisdom that draws a person to be in awe of him so he can say, I don't comprehend everything I've experienced and I don't understand all that I've witnessed in my life, but I can see that there is a God. There are a couple of verses from Psalm 31 that captures these ideas so succinctly. I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands. I know that all God does will last forever. There's no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be already is. God repeats what is past. There's some different thoughts on how to understand that very last phrase, but it literally says God seeks what hurries along. Now, the entire verse is about the timelessness of God. Nothing is new for him because he stands outside the constraints of time. And what he did in the past to unfold his plan is what he will continue to do to bring it to completion. The implication is that since this is true, then the things that escape us, like the events that we don't understand, or the moments that seem to vanish into thin air, are no problem for him. Such times enter our lives and we have no control over their arrival or their duration. And that's the point of this section. God's keeping track of all of it. All events are in the hand of God, who makes everything happen in the time he judges appropriate. And so fearing God and living in awe of who he is means that we're to accept such moments and seasons as delivered from his hands. Even if I cannot discern the appropriateness or the benefit of this particular moment, the fact that God saw fit to use this time in my life means that he has a purpose that fits in with what he desires to accomplish. But here's the good part. And somehow he includes me in that. When we coordinate our hearts and energy with the ebb and flow of God's timing, when we get on board with him, then there is something beautiful there. When you see a well-coordinated event, there is a beauty in the timing and execution of it all, even when the coordination is not in your control. And if you really believe that God is a God of order and not a God of chaos, then you are able to appreciate the value of something at the proper time. There are many Sundays when very few of us feel truly prepared to offer the gifts we're about to share with one another as 10 o'clock rolls around. We did everything we could to put in place and make sure the service outline was clear to everybody involved. And then the technical stuff goes sideways. We realized the creamers for the coffee table went sour. A worship team member loses his or her voice. The one who has a special announcement to make has a family emergency and can't be there, so somebody has to pick it up at the last minute. The one scheduled to pray will be here, but a serious work or home event has completely distracted his thought process. And then the speaker, usually me, is ready, but as the service progresses, it just feels like he's reading and not fully engaged. And after a morning like that, we've come together asking ourselves, what was that? Could anything have been so discombobulated? There are other Sundays when the one praying did not see the list of songs that were chosen ahead of time, nor did that person have a moment to read through the scripture passage connected to the sermon. And then the service begins. And I hear Reuben say something that reinforces what I know I'm going to say in a few moments. And the one leading us in prayer tells a story of something that happened that week that parallels the core of the message without knowing. Then it turns out that the last song had to be changed 30 minutes before the service began, but I didn't know. And yet the ending song could not fit any more tightly with what was just done. And then when our congregation is dismissed, some of us to get together and say, what was that? Without checking in with one another for every specific plan or detail we might like, it appeared that every part fully integrated and merged together, flowing effortlessly, as if there was an invisible hand behind it all. And yet the remarkable part is this: God uses both the disaster of that first worship service and the beauty of the second one to encourage, challenge, or bless someone who was here. As a believer reads that there's a time for every purpose, it's natural to want to be in line with God's plan if you belong to Christ. And a wise person will want to discern the best time to tear down or build up, to keep searching or let something go. Wisdom itself is a matter of timing. What needs to be said or done is often as important as when it needs to be said or done. A man finds joy in giving an apt reply, and how good is a timely word. I know I've mentioned it at other times in the past, but Ecclesiastes has been a valuable part of my personal mindset for many years. And the lesson from these first 15 verses has helped me to be stable when so many other variables keep moving. Try as we might, we don't always know when the moment is appropriate to be silent or to speak up, to plant or to uproot, and that's okay. We're constantly maturing and developing wisdom. I've lived long enough to recognize certain patterns in life are in place and they're relatively fixed. So I've come to approach life this way: live and work and serve in line with the obvious seasons of life. Some things repeat, and we can count on them to do so, including the 4 seasons of the year. There are also certain seasons of life that are best suited for certain activities compared to other periods of life, and we are wise to use those times well. I've also witnessed enough moments when God intervenes and alters the expected pattern, the plans that we so deliberately wanted to see happen. And so when God does introduce a time to you that you did not expect, when God surprises us, allow him the freedom to interrupt your plans and trust him, knowing that he walks with you through it. We've been reminded that every activity under heaven is under the sovereign control of a loving creator. When we reject that reality, we end up fighting against him. And we bring ourselves unnecessary grief and sorrow and heartache. I'm telling you, if you really seek to embrace life as a rhythm, an ebb and flow of the moments of time, you will avoid so much frustration and worry. And I'm convinced that the believers who have the greatest peace in their lives are the ones who have learned to allow God to be God. They've come to trust in him, and they accept that there is an appropriateness to whatever season they're living through, even when they don't get it, because it makes sense to him. So when our best laid schemes fall apart, our best response is to ask the Lord to give us the capacity to live through it in honor of him. If we cooperate with God's timing, life is not meaningless. Heavenly Father, grant us grace in the week ahead to remember the moments that come into our lives most often unexpectedly, and most often not pleasant. Enable us to trust you in it, even though we don't understand the beginning point or when the end may come. Give us the capacity and the peace to know that you're still in charge, that at some point when we meet you, you'll let us know why. And we thank you for those moments, even here, as we look back on certain periods of life, we even understand why they happen now. Thank you for those gifts. Help us to appreciate you as the Lord who loves us desperately, and that your dreams for us are bigger than our dreams for ourselves. Help us to be able to embrace those things, to be open to them, and to challenge one another to seek after them instead of our own plans, particularly when our own plans are not a problem at all. It just doesn't work out as we thought. Allow us to accept your sovereign control of our lives because we belong to you. Amen.
Please stand.